Welcome back to Skeptics and Seekers, everyone. I am your host, David Johnson the Skeptic, and I'm joined by my other host.
I'm Dale, representing the Christian or Seeker side.
And just to make things interesting, we've got a very special guest, Mr. Mike Licona. How are you doing?
Well, good, David. Dale, great to be on your podcast.
Thank you for coming on.
Excellent. Now, we've got like 3 pages of accolades for Mike Licona, but honestly, look it up. We don't have that kind of time. Dale, why don't you tell us a little bit about Mike? Give us the short version.
Yeah, so I think most of our listenership will be familiar with Mike Licona from the Unbelievable show. He's a famous biblical scholar. He's written several books. 2 of the most important to me in my research were The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach, and most recently, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? What we can learn from ancient biography. I'm mostly excited to have Mike Licona on for personal reasons because he's been helpful to me during my search personally, and I really appreciate having on fellow Christian guests and apologists that really care about people and trying to reach out and help them come to a knowledge of Christ. So, I'm really grateful to you, Mike, for doing us the favor of coming on and for everything you've done for me in my coming to faith.
Well, thanks, Dale. My pleasure, brother.
And I was excited to have Mike on because Mike is one of the, should I say few? He's one of the Christian apologists that, as an atheist, I really like. I really enjoy. So he's a Christian apologist that I knew when I was still a Christian. I liked him then, and I liked him after the fact. And so that hasn't been true of all of the apologists that I once liked. And I think the thing that I like about Mike most is that he will tell you what he actually believes, even when it makes him vulnerable. And by vulnerable, I mean, he doesn't mind getting in trouble with his own side. And so you can kind of get a sense that he's shooting straight with you. Because sometimes there's blowback and he ends up shooting himself in the face, and he'll still keep firing. Way to go, Mike.
Hey, just to correct something there, David, it's not that I don't mind getting friendly fire. I mean, I don't enjoy that, but I'm willing to do it in the interest of discovering truth.
Yeah, so we really both appreciate that about you. Mike, tell us something about yourself, maybe a project you're working on. This is a good time to go ahead and plug something because we're going to forget to do it at the end of the show because we're really lousy at this. So let's go ahead and take the time now and tell us, what 2 or 3 books do you want people to buy? We'll put some links in the show notes, and what website or Twitter feed you want people to follow. Just take a moment to plug.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. My website is risenjesus.com. That's pretty simple. I'm on Facebook and Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Michael_Licona. My Facebook, I have a personal page and a public figure page. I don't accept friend requests from people I don't know or barely know on my personal page. Because I've tried to get I used to have 5,000, now I'm down to like 900, but I'd really like to get that even lower because then I don't see what's going on with my real friends. So they can go to my public figure page, which is facebook.com/michael.r.licona, and there they're going to see the posts that they want to see anyway. Let's see, what else? Books, the 2 Dale mentioned, The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach if someone is really interested in getting a very in-depth look at the resurrection of Jesus. Did he rise from the dead? So in that, I start off and I talk about the philosophy of history. What is history? How knowable is the past? How do we come to know the past to some degree? Who has the burden of proof? What is the burden of proof? What happens when miracles are involved? What are our best sources? What do we learn from those sources? And then what's the best explanation for what we learn from those sources? So I try to be as objective in that as possible. It's 700 and some pages, and it's fairly thorough. My most recent book is the other one that Dale mentioned. Why are there differences in the Gospels? What we can learn from ancient biography. This is a groundbreaking book insofar as it deals with gospel differences from a whole new perspective, a whole new angle. Richard Burridge's book, What Are the Gospels, from 1993, and he just had his 25th anniversary edition of it published by Baylor. In that book, he argues that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies, or that they share much in common with Greco-Roman biography, and that that genre, the literary conventions for writing ancient biography differ somewhat from what the literary conventions for writing modern biography. There were flexibilities that ancient biographers were allowed that modern biographers, they use some of them, but they would eschew others of them. That would be too much flexibility and creativity. So realizing that, if we read the Gospels in view of their ancient biographical genre, does that help us to shed light on certain things in the Gospels, like gospel differences? And it does. It sheds a lot of light on it. So that was my most recent book. This year, I'm working on a popular level version of it. I've been asked several times to do that. So that's what I'm working on. And this year, hope to have it done by November. And we'll be dealing with how does this impact things such as divine inspiration, biblical inerrancy, and authority. And the other project I'm working on at the moment is, and been doing for several years, is the historical reliability of the Gospels in view of their biographical genre. And that's kind of a thorny issue, I'm finding. So that's what I'm working on right now. In fact, I have a journal article on it where I'm going to be assessing Suetonius's Life of Augustus with the Gospel of Mark, according to 4 criteria for reliability. So that's in a nutshell what I'm doing right now.
Okay.
Perfect. And
You say 700 pages.
Yes.
Yeah, so the last time I read 700-page book, it was like the Portland, Oregon phone book. Slow read, bad plot line. I used to sell ads for Verizon, so
I recommend, though, David, if you are interested in studying the evidence for the resurrection, this is one of the best resources. So it is worth it to go through the 700 pages there if you can find the time. It is really worth it from what I've read there.
yeah, I'm looking forward to it, actually.
Perfect. So I think that's a good segue into our sort of introduction. So Mike, if you could maybe give us sort of an indication of your faith journey. I mentioned that you've been helpful for me in certain ways in my research when I was going through my doubts, and I know that's something that you've been through yourself. So maybe just give us sort of an introduction to your faith journey and any doubts or anything that you had along the way.
Sure, Dale. Well, I was kind of strange as a kid insofar as I remember my mom left my dad at age 5 and ended up getting divorced. And so when we moved in with my grandparents, we started to go to a Presbyterian church down the street. And I can remember probably at age 7 or 8 walking to church with my mom and saying, "Mom, how do I get to heaven? How do we get to heaven?" And she'd say, "Well, Mike, you just have to do more good than bad." And I said, "Well, I got a sister. I pull her hair. I hit her. I cause her to cry. What happens if I've done more bad than good?" She said, "Well, then you go to hell to be with the devil forever." And I'm thinking, well, where am I on that scale? And it was just something just strange that at an early age, I just wanted to know how to get to heaven. So at age 10, my mom had remarried. We had moved to Baltimore County, and we were going to a different Presbyterian church, and they combined the Sunday school for youth one Sunday. I'm guessing it was in the summer. And they brought in a Christian magician. And this guy would do magic, and then he would relate what he was doing to the gospel of Jesus, the message of Jesus, that, he died for us and we can have eternal life. And for the first time, it made sense to me what the gospel was and how the Christian message of how to have eternal life. The guy tricked me into heaven, this magician, So they gave an invitation at this Presbyterian church, which is strange for Presbyterians. And I remember 3 of us went up. I went up. I thought, this is what I've been looking for. And I went up and put my faith in Christ that day. I didn't grow too much. I just grew a little bit spiritually as a teen, and went to a Christian university, Liberty University. I was a music major there. Christian environment. I was really growing spiritually. I was got to a point where I was reading the Bible an hour to 2 hours a day in undergrad. I was praying an hour to 2 hours a day. And again, that's just, I know it's strange for a college student that age, but I was just spiritually hungry and a hunger to know God. So I decided I wanted to be able to read the New Testament in its original language, Greek. So I enrolled in grad school. I had been an average student my entire life. I have ADD. I have an average IQ. I think I had like a 2.84, 85 GPA in undergrad and only one semester in Greek I took as an elective, but I did really well. I got an A. They let me into grad school on probation. I had to take a year's worth of Greek over the summer before getting in, and I aced all my Greek courses. Toward the end of my master's degree in religious studies, I started to have doubts about the Christian faith. And it wasn't necessarily anything that brought it on. It was just, how do I really know this stuff is true? I think I've got this relationship with the Lord, but don't the Mormons who come to my front door think the same way? What about Muslims? What about Buddhists and Hindus? And, is it a matter of I was just born in the United States and therefore I ended up being a Christian because I'm in a Christian family? This started to really bother me. That's when I heard about Gary Habermas, and I had a roommate who was doing a master's degree in apologetics. I had no use for apologetics up to that point, but I decided to go see Gary, and we talked, and he helped me at that point. And it was enough to get me through grad school. I went home, and then I'm starting to bump into people who were not believers, and they would challenge my faith, and I didn't know how to answer it. And I'd call Gary. And there's no email back then, but I'd call Gary and talk to him, and we became really good friends over the years. And that's kind of strange too. Students and professors typically don't become best of friends, but Gary and I did, and he really helped me. I don't think I'd be a Christian today if it weren't for him. And he'd give me evidence and point me to different resources, and so I'd read and I'd listen to audio cassette tapes and things like that, and that really helped my faith. Then I decided that I wanted to do a PhD later on. So that was probably the mid 80s. Then we get to I finished my master's degree actually in 2000 because I just got out of school and just was working and everything. And I didn't think I'd ever do a PhD, but I ended up 3 years later enrolling in one because I wanted to learn. And I decided I'd study the resurrection of Jesus as a historian. So I had to learn what historians do, what tools and methods they work by. And so that's what led me into this. And quickly I found that historians were saying there's no such thing as an unbiased historian, and one's biases, one's desires will quickly compromise the integrity of their investigation. I thought, well, that's me, because I'm setting out in this because I want to prove the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, I'd looked and I'd say the whole thing that I've done in apologetics to prove the Christian faith for me, I was only looking at the evidence to prove what I already believed. And so I recognized, I started to doubt again. And so it was at that point that I went out one night and I prayed and I said, God, I do believe that you exist. I believe Christianity is true, but I'm plagued by doubt. I have been for years. I understand it's just the way I'm wired. Many of us are just wired that way. I need to do this investigation with integrity, and I know this is probably going to make our relationship cold, at least for a while, and maybe I'm going to, God, if Christianity is false, I want to know it. So you can humiliate me in debates or whatever. I just want to know that it's false. I want to follow truth wherever it leads. And my wife and Gary and Bill Craig and my doctoral supervisor, it was a very closed group, but they knew how much I struggled, wrestled with this. And I almost lost my faith several times. I was just trying to be as neutral, as open, as unbiased as possible. I really wrestled with it. And but at the end of the day, I truly believe that the evidence tips in favor quite heavily for Jesus rising from the dead and that Christianity is true. I can't say that that means I never have any doubts. I still have doubts at times, um, but that's the way I'm wired and the way I've come to understand it. Um, I'll say this when I'm upstage lecturing at times. If you put a plank, sometimes you're up on the stage and they'll have these little marks of tape on the stage, and they'll tell you, stay within this area because that's where the lighting is. Don't go outside this area where this tape is. And so I can do that easily. If it's, let's just say you've got 10 feet broadly and then most across the stage, I could do cartwheels. I could jog backwards. But if you take that same space, extend it, and suspend it between two skyscrapers and say, now I want you to walk across this, I'm going to be worried. I'm not going to want to do it. I'm not going to do it. And it's not that I can't do it. I could easily do it. The thing is that gets in your mind is, what if? What if? Because the consequences are so terrible. So I look at the evidence for Christianity and, with my feet planted here on the earth, and I say, the evidence looks quite good to me. But then at times I'll be laying in bed at night and wondering about it and say, but what if I'm wrong? What are the potential eternal consequences here? And that's what worries me. So it's an emotional kind of doubt for me. It's not an intellectual kind of doubt any longer. So that's kind of my spiritual journey. But because of this, I'm really after truth, because we have nothing to fear about the truth. What I have to fear is that my biases will be so strong that it will prevent me from discovering truth and cost me eternity. That is what keeps me awake at night.
So, just as a quick follow-up, you spoke about doubts in a kind of a general way. Is there any particular area of doctrine or research that you find a little bit more challenging in that regard?
I wouldn't say so, Dale. It's probably more of there are intelligent people who think differently, like, David, who's on here. He's an intelligent guy. He thinks differently. There's a lot of scholars and philosophers who think differently. They arrive at different conclusions. Of course, that doesn't mean they're right or wrong, or just because, there are a lot of intelligent people who think like I do. So, but that's an emotional thing. We wish we had more evidence. I wish we had more evidence. But the issue isn't I think we have sufficient evidence to establish the truth of Christianity, and that's the question: is it sufficient? But yeah, of course, I wish we had more. And it's not just these things. It's atheists even doubt too. Antony Flew, who died, I don't know, like 15 years ago, one of perhaps the most influential atheist philosopher of the latter part of the 20th century. And Gary Habermas, I think it was, asked him once, because they were good friends. He says, Tony, do you ever doubt your atheism? And he says, Gary, I doubt it every day. C.S. Lewis was asked if he were, after he was a Christian, the BBC asked him, do you ever doubt your Christianity? He says, yeah, I do. There are days when atheism seems more plausible. But I have to admit, when I was an atheist, there were days when Christianity seemed more plausible. So I think doubting is something that can be normal. It can be healthy. As long as you keep it in perspective, rather than you just become a perpetual unchecked doubter, that can just go too far. You have to look at the evidence, put a check on the emotions, and be thinking, or logic here, what's going on. So, but it's when the emotions take over and it's just that emotional doubt, what if I'm wrong? That's what causes me to doubt. It's not any particular argument or anything like that.
So, Mike, this is David. Before we move on to the gospel section, I wanted to just give Dale a chance to follow up.
All I was going to say is I hardly agree with what Mike said, and that's why I wanted him to give sort of a general outline of his story, because I resonate a lot with.
Oh, I thought you said you hardly agree with what I said.
that was David that asked you the question. That wasn't. But no, I agree 100% with.
You wholeheartedly agree, as opposed to you hardly agree.
Yeah.
Is that what it
So,
David, that we'll blame that on the Skype connection then. No, I think it's absolutely right. I myself, even, I've done all this research and now I'm at the point where I think I have sufficient evidence to believe in Christianity and live my life according to Christian precepts and that sort of thing. But I still have doubts. I'm not 100% certain Christianity's true. It is possible I've gotten things wrong. So one has to always remain what I call a real seeker and be open to the truth and learning that you're wrong on something. But at the same time, you don't have to have unreasonable demands like, I won't be a Christian until I'm 100% certain.
Yes, right.
Exactly. So
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I wholeheartedly agree with you, Dale.
thank you, Mike.
otherwise
and
known as
something
he
else
hardly agrees with you.
something else about doubt that I found about myself, and it is this way for a number of people, but it's not that way for most people. I have found that it is the way I'm wired, and it's not just my faith I doubt, it's a lot of different things. So I remember when I was a college student, my dad took me down to the stepdad took me down to the one Christmas. I think it was when I was a freshman. I was home for Thanksgiving break. He says, "What do you want for Christmas?" I said, "I think I'd like a new watch." He said, "Okay, you want a nice watch?" I said, "Yeah, I'd like a pretty nice watch." And so, I mean, we were a middle class family. So nice watch didn't mean a Tag Heuer or a Omega or anything like that. A nice watch was Seiko. So, and Seikos were just coming out at that point. He says, "I'm going to take you," there were really not too many malls at that point. So he said, "I'm going to take you downtown in the city of Baltimore, and we're going to go to this nice jewelry store. You can pick one out." And I remember they had this whole wall full of watches, and I came down to two, and it probably took me 20 minutes to half an hour to choose between those two. It's just, that's the way my wife hates to go shopping with me because I'm that way sometimes. It's over stupid little things that it takes me forever to make a decision. And then I'll make that decision and I will regret that decision. And it's over little things. So did I get the right watch? Did I marry the right woman? Did I get the right car? Anything like that. I mean, I married a fantastic woman, but I doubted it for the first 20 years of our marriage. And it wasn't anything because of her. That's just the way I'm wired. And so we tend to doubt everything. It's just not our faith. So once I realized that made a whole lot more sense of my doubting to me and helped me.
So just another quick follow-up to this. This
Yeah.
is David again. We really have other questions to ask, but this is fascinating. So you would describe yourself as an evidentialist, I take it.
Yes.
And that differs from me. When I was a Christian, I was not an evidentialist. I grew up in the church, and I was a Christian by a faith standard that didn't have anything to do with the evidence. In fact, if you had asked me, what was the evidence of the Christian faith, I couldn't have told you. It probably wouldn't have been to my 30s before I could have talked about evidences of the Christian faith. It seems to me that evidentialists walk a more difficult path because your faith is dependent on some fairly concrete things that you can't fully grasp because they're not fully concrete. You're dealing with history, and how much of that can you actually prove? And what if someone else can disprove something that was important to you? Or what if some new evidence comes along? It seems like faith was based on things that I didn't grow up considering faith. So to me, faith was the assurance that you had without the evidence, or to take Jesus at his words, better to believe without evidence as opposed to believing because you see the wounds. And so can you talk about the differences there? Because it always seemed to me that your type of faith, the evidentialist faith, is a more difficult path to walk.
Yeah. Well, David, I can say that I was much like you all the way through grad school. Like I said, I had some roommates who were doing a master's degree in Christian apologetics at Liberty. At the time, I had one during my senior year in college, and then I had two during my graduate years. To me, apologetics was just irrelevant. I mean, they would talk about David Hume, they would talk about evidences for the Christian faith and evidences for God's existence, evidence for the resurrection. And I can remember thinking, I'm not interested in that. I don't need evidence. I've got a relationship with Christ. I love reading his word. I know Christianity's true. Apologetics and evidence was completely without value to me until I started doubting. And then evidence became really important. But I would say that I don't know that it takes, I don't know, maybe it's just where we are in our thinking at the time, David, because as an evidentialist today, I mean, I recognize that there is nothing that we can really know with 100%, pretty much about the past. Mm-hmm. We can't know something about antiquity with 100% certainty, and so but that's not just Christianity. That's any worldview. You're an atheist, David. You can't know that this universe came into existence out of nothing, or that there are multi-universes, and that there's no creator, or that everything is here by natural causes. You can't know that with 100% certainty. So, because the evidence just isn't there. So you're an evidentialist too, to an extent. So we look for evidence, and we may judge that evidence differently. And we're going to look at it and try to make the decision in our own best interest as far as eternity. At least that's what I'm doing, as far as I have eternity in mind when I'm making my decisions on this. So, you're an evidentialist in that way. I'm an evidentialist. Dale is certainly an evidentialist. I'm not saying that Christians who are with the mindset that I used to have, that they're misguided. You can take a different approach and you can still be right. Like, I'm an evidentialist. I think Christianity's true. So presuppositionalists like John Frame, like James White, I don't like their approach. I would never take their approach. But they believe the same thing I believe in terms of the faith. If Christianity's true, then they believe it. They just believe it for with a different approach. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And one last thing before I let David go on to his main topic about the Gospels and that sort of thing. But just to back up what Mike's saying here, it's not, depending on what you mean by evidentialist, and I think you're referring to sort of objective evidences like historical evidence for the resurrection or evidence from the shroud. But God has another form of evidence that's subjective, that played a role in my coming to faith through, the inner witness of the Holy Spirit and properly basic beliefs. So in my case, it's actually a combination. Neither one was sufficient on its own, but cumulatively, the objective evidence plus the subjective evidence was enough to overcome, any negative evidences. So it's not that they're not necessarily exclusive. Because I know, David, you would include like properly basic beliefs. That's presuppositionalism to you, even though I would differ and say that's evidence. It's just evidence of a different sort. It's subjective, and that sort. So yeah, I would just say they're reinforcing. They're not mutually exclusive necessarily.
Okay. Yeah, and I would add to that. I did not become a Christian because of the evidence, but I am a Christian today because of the evidence.
Mm.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yes. So that's how I understand it too. I don't know anyone who started from scratch, looked at the evidence, and said, "You know what? Christianity. That's it." Now I know what's his name, Strobel.
Yeah. Lee Strobel,
yes,
Josh McDowell.
His conceit is that is. I honestly don't believe Strobel's account that he comes at it clean and looks at the evidence and says, "Oh no, that's Christianity." Some of the others we could talk about. I definitely relate quite a bit to Josh McDowell, much more.
C.S. Lewis.
Strobel. Another topic where I wish that we could have a conversation directly with C.S. Lewis. I have questions.
Now tell me, why don't you believe Strobel? I mean, I know Strobel. He's a He's an honest guy. He's a great guy. I mean, maybe I'm biased in just accepting his account, but I know Leslie, his wife, and I mean, she's affirmed what he said. I mean, he was an angry atheist. When his wife Leslie became a Christian, he was kicking holes in the wall of their house. He was so upset with her, and he looked at the evidence, and he ended up becoming a Christian. And I've asked him. I said, Lee, were you trying to disprove it? He said, no, I really wanted to be open with it. So, I mean, certainly if you watched his movie, it was, you know, there's dramatic license involved, there's literary license involved in that, but the story, you know, it represents at least as far as I can tell, an accurate gist of his conversion experience.
Yeah, I read the books. I watched the movies. Even as I read the books, I thought, you know, this seems a little bit contrived.
Okay.
So without going too deeply in that, it struck me as a setup as opposed to an honest investigation. A setup with a conclusion, and this is how I'm going to tell the story, as opposed to this is what happened. No, I'm not married to the idea that is in fact how it happens. That's the impression that I was left with. That's the impression that, you know, others who read the book have been left with too. I mean, I know that it's had good reviews and bad, but I'm not the only one to walk away with it from that. But I don't have personal knowledge of Lee Strobel, and I accept your assessment that he's a good guy who had an honest journey. But all I know of Lee Strobel is the words on the page, and they felt a little bit contrived to me, so I didn't buy it.
Well, they've certainly been reworked, of course, right, from what actually happened, because it's for a book, for a movie. So there is literary license that's involved in there. And it's probably kind of, David, it's probably kind of like, you know, you go out and let's say you have a conversation with a Christian and you walk away and you're thinking, man, I ate that guy up. I ate him alive. I just crushed him. And you come back and you're talking to someone else about the conversation, and you're repeating the conversation with your arguments. You're conflating or abbreviating them. You're making them a little more clear than perhaps you did in that conversation to make your point a little more clear. Like if you could rewrite the conversation, that's how you would rewrite it, and that's how you relay it.
Right.
I mean, we all do that, right?
Right.
And I'm sure there's some of that, quite a bit of that's going on in Strobel's books.
Sure, and you know, having written a book, I can say that when you're recounting things that happened in the distant past, none of it's true. It's all reconstructed memory. You're not lying about it, but
well, it's true enough, right?
Right. I mean, it's true. It's truish, but it's not. It's not a videotape. You're not transcribing a videotape of what happened.
Right.
So I recognize that. Look, let's move on to the New Testament before we lose our time. And people will say, yes, great conversation, but why didn't you ask him about the area of his expertise? So I'm going to we're gonna make sure that we do that. Tell us a little bit about the genre of the gospel. Now, since you included a lot of this in your introduction, we might can abbreviate some of this, but I'm particularly interested in the genre of the Gospels. I hear a lot of apologists and or professors and people, academics, talk about the Gospels as if it is a wholly unique category. So it's neither history nor hagiography or legend or myth or anything. It's something entirely different and unique. Yeah. And others would categorize it in a more general way. So let me just start with that one. Are the Gospels a unique thing on this earth, and there's nothing quite comparable, or do they fit neatly into a category?
Well, of course, they're unique in the sense every biography, all literature is unique in some sense. The Gospels, the most New Testament scholars up until, let's say, toward the end of the 20th century, they used to think that they were biographies. And then later on, with German criticism, Up until the end of the 20th century, most scholars were thinking of the Gospels as sui generis, a unique genre. But then Burridge's book came out, and he was trying to refute Charles Talbert and David Awney and some others who were claiming that the Gospels were ancient biographies of the Greco-Roman genre. There wasn't any real Jewish biography at that time, so Greco-Roman biography was pretty much the only game in town if you were going to write a biography of your sage or of someone. So he set out to disprove that, and he came to the conclusion that he was wrong and that the Gospels indeed belong to the genre of Greco-Roman biography. Now, more study has been done on it since then, where I can say scholars are today, and I'm talking about a pretty large majority of New Testament scholars, whether they are atheistic, agnostic, Jewish, liberal, moderate, conservative New Testament scholars, the large majority now believe that the Gospels at least share much in common with the genre of Greco-Roman biography.
How does Greco-Roman biography different from biography today?
Well, good question. So the objective was a little bit different. So we go to Plutarch. Plutarch is the greatest of all ancient biographers. And he wrote just a couple of decades after the Gospels, and he wrote in the same language, Greek. And Plutarch wrote over 60 biographies, of which 50 have survived. And his biography of Alexander the Great, chapter 1, is the most frequently quoted passage in Plutarch. And there he talks about the difference between biography and history. History is about an era, about a people, about a war, like Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, things like that. Whereas a biography is a story about an individual. And he goes on to say that there are a lot of events in an individual's life that he's not going to report, and his readers should be patient with him and not say, well, why didn't you report this? He says, because this is biography, not history. And in biography, the objective is to reveal the character of the main person. Who is this person? What character traits should a person emulate, and which ones should they eschew? It was for the reader's benefit to improve their own life, and it was to reveal who this person is or was. So we are going to use those, report those. You're going to be select in reporting only those events and teach what a person said that reveal the inner qualities of who that person was. Mm-hmm. So you're going to be selecting that way. So let me just give a modern example. I'm not aware of any biography like this today, but if you were going to write a biography of Martin Luther King Jr., and your objective was to reveal his courageousness and heroism during the civil rights movement of the 60s in order to encourage people to stand up for the oppressed today, you would be select in what you reported about Martin Luther King Jr., all these positive things about him, but you would omit something like his marital infidelities because that would not contribute to who he was with your objective in mind of encouraging people to emulate that to help the oppressed of today. Okay. So that's what they would do in antiquity. And you could do these kinds of compositional devices. You compress stories, you conflate stories, you transfer what one person said on an occasion, put it on the lips of another one in order to simplify the story. You would do all these kinds of things. You could take some liberties in the way you reported things. You could paraphrase things in order to, in fact, that was the prescription. You were supposed to paraphrase rather than quote a person verbatim. If you quoted a person verbatim, that was poor history writing. So those are the kinds of things and others, and how ancient history differs, or ancient biography differs from modern biography.
Okay, so let me just throw another word in there, hagiography.
Yeah, well, that didn't come until centuries later.
Okay, but so my understanding of it is very simplistic, but I would say that it's kind of like the biography you described, plus a lot of exaggeration that does hero service. It seems like there's a fairly short step between the Greco-Roman biography and hagiography. And so it seems like some of the stories in the New Testament, for instance, might might move over to that genre, even if that genre wasn't particularly named at that time. So can you tell me some of the reasons why I would be wrong for thinking of the Gospels as hagiography as opposed to the biographies that you described?
Hagiography is a genre that didn't come until centuries later. I haven't studied that genre much because I focus on the literature written around the first century.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a different genre. I can't really give you some specifics, and I'd rather not speculate there, and talk on something of which I'm just not familiar. What I can say is that even in other ancient biographies of that period, like Plutarch,
Mm-hmm.
And others, they would report some things that were exaggerations. In fact, Lucian of Samosata, in How to Write History, I believe it was, which was written around the middle of the 2nd century, he talks about how Aristobulus, who was a biographer of Alexander the Great, they were on a voyage together, and Aristobulus gave Alexander a draft of his biography of Alexander, and Alexander started to read it, and he saw the story about where it said Alexander killed an elephant single-handedly, and Alexander took the biography and he threw it overboard, and he said, Aristobulus, I ought to do the same to you because this is a false story, and people will read this, and they will not believe it, and then they won't believe the things that I have done that have been great things. So we could see that ancient biographers could throw in some false stories. Most historians would say that a lot of what's contained in Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana is false, is fiction. But for the most part, you would have biographers who would be writing. They were attempting to give you a fairly accurate account of what that person was doing. Yes, they might exaggerate some things at times. Yes, they may take some liberties that we may, as moderns, not feel real comfortable with them. But they don't usually engage in wholesale invention.
Okay, so before I turn it back over to Dale, let me just round out this series of questions. Two more real quick. So would you say that Acts is the same genre as the Gospels, or is that a different genre?
I think it's different genre.
Okay.
It's historiography. It's a history of the first 3 decades of the Christian church. And because of that, there are a number of scholars like Ben Witherington who would say that Luke is not biography, it is history as well, because Luke Acts is like a combination. It's volume 1 and volume 2.
Right.
Almost all would believe that. So he thinks since Acts is history, he thinks that Luke is also history. And Luke does bear some qualities of history writing, but I don't think that makes it history. Plutarch, despite what he says in his Life of Alexander the Great, and he's got similar statements in other of his biographies, his Life of Julius Caesar reads more like a history than it does a biography. He is not focusing on the character of Julius Caesar in that biography. He is more concerned with what was it about Julius Caesar that got him so popular amongst the average Roman, the average person. So it has qualities of history in it, but still no one is going to question that Plutarch's Life of Julius Caesar was a biography. So sometimes the lines that distinguish biography and history can be fuzzy. But no, almost everyone would say that Acts is history, not biography.
Okay, so my last question in this line has to do with how we are to read the events in the Gospels. So the analogy that I can come up with, at least it's useful to me, hopefully to the listener.
David, sorry to interrupt. Before we get to that,
okay.
I think it might be helpful just to lay out. So Mike, given the nature of the Gospels being Greco-Roman biography, and there are examples if we're looking at it from, okay, straightforward history, did this thing happen or not?
Yeah.
Do you think there are any examples in the Gospels of actual historical errors, and not in the sense that it's an error from the author's viewpoint or something like that, but if we traveled in a time machine, this thing didn't happen type thing?
Well, of course, the parables, right? That would be one.
So sayings, yeah.
I also, one thing I've gotten in trouble with was some of those on the far right. And I just the far right, because those who aren't so out there on the far right would agree with me. It's not an original idea with me, but the Matthew's report that the saints raised at Jesus' death and came out and appeared to others after Jesus rose from the dead. I tend to think that had we been there, we wouldn't see that. And I don't think that Matthew intends for us. I'm not saying Matthew gives us a false report. What I am saying is that Matthew did not intend for his readers to understand that in a literal historical sense. We find similar things in Jewish literature, like Josephus in his Jewish War. And we also find it in a lot of the Greco-Roman literature, like Livy, Philo, Cassius Dio, Plutarch. We find these kinds of things in there, like darkness, ghosts of the dead coming out at sunset and walking around. All these, a lot of these kind of things we see in the Greco-Roman and Jewish literature. So these are special effects. It would be like today us saying 9/11 was an earth-shaking event, or it rained cats and dogs. We don't mean for people to interpret that language in a literal historical sense. It's linguistic idioms, it's rhetorical devices, and I think that's what Matthew's doing there. Perfect. So to say I think Matthew is falsely reporting or something that's in the Gospels that if we'd been there we wouldn't see it. By saying that, I just need to clarify what I mean by that.
Perfect.
So you're saying that you don't think that anything they meant to be literal didn't happen. You think everything they meant to be literal actually happened.
That's right. Now, I can't prove that, but I don't have reason to believe if we come out, if we allow the supernatural, okay, and once we look at the evidence, if we conclude that Jesus rose from the dead, which I think the evidence is sufficient for that, if we believe that Jesus rose from the dead, then things such as a virgin birth is child's play. Walking on water for a deity is nothing. Feeding 5,000 for a deity is nothing. So if Jesus was who he claimed to be, then the miraculous events are entirely at home. Now, we can debate over things like, did the author actually intend for us to think this? Is the virgin birth something that was meant to be understood in a historical context, or is this some sort of a way of writing literature and honoring, someone of greatness? You could ask those kinds of questions, and those would be fair questions. Some of them would be unanswerable, I think.
Okay.
But did they lie about it or just invent something? I don't see any reason to think that they did.
I think that we could get stuck there for a long time, and I would love to. Maybe we can have you back sometime, and we can get stuck in this particular topic. But I think that the topic of whether a thing happened or didn't happen is even broader than that. So if you go outside of the more challenging events like the Great Resurrection of Matthew 27, and move on to something like the woman caught in adultery, the same question applies. That's that, and that would be a fair question, sure. And that's an issue of the manuscripts and whether it was part of the original. Yes, but for the average person reading this, it's a matter of did it happen or did it not happen.
Sure.
So
and some people,
I understand that there are
a number of scholars
issues.
would say that story may be authentic. It just didn't belong in John, or it was something that people knew to be historical and was included at a later time. But things like that, I think we can bracket it and say, we don't know and we can't know. It's kind of like the ending of Mark. Okay, that wasn't in the original. Verses 9 through 20 about picking up snakes and drinking poison. That wasn't in the original one. So you can't blame the Gospels and detract from their reliability just because English translations often include a dubious text.
Okay, so and what did David's question, I guess, for the average Christian then was something like the ending of Mark. If I'm just an average Christian and I know about some issues with it, I guess what the average Christian should do is sort of put a bracket on that and not go out and start drinking poison or that sort of thing. Like I think that's what David's trying to get. Like with these sort of issues is, well, it's part of Scripture, so the Christian should interpret it as, in the same way they do other things that aren't questionable, or should they say, well, we know it's questionable, so we'll just put a hold on that until we learn more type thing?
How do you even know when there's a bracket? I mean, like the Matthew 27 incident, just as an example. Yeah, so we can put a bracket around that, but that's because you and I have a little bit of scholarship around this. But a reader is reading this story. Everything in this story is absolutely read literally as straight biography or history, however you think about it. And then you get to this thing, and suddenly it's not straight history anymore. This one little piece that's not even a whole verse long is certainly figurative and no longer literal.
Well,
Then you go back to literal. How is anyone supposed to know that?
I wouldn't say it's quite that simple, David. You look at the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, I think 24 and following. There are numerous items in that should not be understood in a literal sense, that they are figurative. And in fact, you come to the book of Acts and Pentecost, and it talks about speaking in tongues, and the people out there were saying these guys are filled with new wine, and Peter gets up and says, no, it's too early in the day. I think that's kind of funny, actually, because that could be read to understand, yeah, come back and see us tonight. So it's like, it's
I always
too
thought
early.
that's pretty bad evidence. I mean, a lot of people who drink when it's too early in the day.
It's too early in the day. He says this is a fulfillment of what Joel the prophet said. And he's referring to Joel chapter 2, where he says, young men will have visions, old men will have dreams. The Spirit of the Lord falls upon you. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Well, they were speaking in tongues, and yet he's talking about visions and dreams. And that same context also talks about the sun going dark, the stars falling out of the sky. Well, none of that was meant to be interpreted in a literal sense. They're talking about that in phenomenological, special effects language there. And Peter's saying that has been fulfilled in their presence that day, and he tells them to call in the name of the Lord and be saved. So we find this kinds of stuff throughout there. We find parables, we find this apocalyptic kind of language. So to say that the whole Gospel of Matthew is to be understood literally, historically, until you get that fragment of that verse, I think is a mischaracterization of that. You do have these kinds of things in the Olivet Discourse. Mm-hmm. You've got parables. So you have genres within genres. And it would be just, David, it'd be like you and I talking about 9/11 and the events of that day. And then I just throw in that phrase, yeah, it was an earth-shaking event, wasn't it? And he said, wait a minute, you must mean that in a historical sense, because the whole thing we've been talking about actually happened. We could see it on video. And then you just throw in this one statement like that. That's not to be interpreted literally. Well, how do we know that that's not to be interpreted literally? Well, that's where study and research comes in.
So for the sake of time, I want to let you get away with that, but for the sake of pride, I can't. So the fact is, yes, I get that, but I don't think that example really pertains. If we're talking about the 9/11 incidents, and then you throw in something like that, first of all, I understand that you're using figure of language. We're using figure of language throughout. But if you were to say it was an earth-shaking event, in fact, the news reporter said it was a 6.2 on the Richter scale, and 3 buildings fell that were otherwise protected because of that. So you're giving these verisimilitudes. Now it sounds like you're talking literally. That's what happens in the Matthew story. So he doesn't just throw in an idiom and go out. He actually adds some verisimilitudes, such as, and this is when they came from the grave, and it was before this time. And so he adds some things around that that kind of take it outside of the figurative language. So I think that's why it doesn't read quite the way you've categorized it there.
Well, I would say, well, I agree with you there. I mean, there's no perfect analogy, except I can give an analogy from, at least from modernity here, but I can give some analogies from antiquity. So when Julius Caesar died, we've got a numerous accounts of his assassination. And yet we've have some of this similar phenomena that's reported. So Livy reports numerous items phenomena that happened at Caesar's assassination. There was a comet. There was darkness. Mount Etna erupted. Black intestines were seen outside of cattle. Streams stopped flowing. Fighting was seen in the heavens. So these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Cassius Dio says that when Caesar went into Egypt, that the doors to the temple of Zeus, which took several men to opened by themselves. Fighting was seen in the heaven. There was a comet. Voices were heard in the forest. When Josephus says just before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, a cow gave birth to a lamb. There was a comet. There was a light in the middle of the night that shone down on the temple that was brighter than day. There were voices heard in the temple that said, "We are now leaving this place." The temple gates, which took more than 20 men to opened by themselves. You start to see that there is a pattern with this stuff in ancient historical and biographical writings. So no one doubts that when Josephus and others report the destruction of the Jerusalem temple that it occurred, or that Caesar went into Egypt, or that he was assassinated. It's just that when you read this stuff in the ancient literature, and then it's got these kind of portents that are added into it for special effect to emphasize the gravity of the situation, then you start to see how this works more. And to complicate things more, John Ramsey wrote a book published, I don't know, about 15 years ago. It wasn't a bestseller. John Ramsey's a friend of mine. He's a retired classicist from the University of Illinois in Chicago. And he wrote a catalog of comets in the Greco-Roman literature from 500 BC to 400 AD. Like I said, it wasn't a bestseller. And in that, he takes, as far as he knows, every account where it mentions a comet in the Greco-Roman literature during those 900 years. Mm-hmm. He puts it in the original language, the Latin or Greek, and then he translates it. And then he tries to verify in some cases whether that comet was there. Sometimes you can show that it was because it's multiply attested in the Chinese literature, which would have had no connection with the Greco-Roman literature. Other times we know that the comet was there because it was Halley's Comet or the Hale-Bopp Comet, something like that. Now, what's really interesting in a couple of those cases that also reports that not only was there a comet, but there was also an eclipse of the sun. Now, we can verify the comet, but what's interesting, you can go, there's a website NASA has where you can enter a year, click on a geographical region, and it will tell you whether there was a visible eclipse in that region that year. So in some cases, you can show that the comet is authentic in that report, but the eclipse was not, which shows that the Greco-Roman author commingled natural phenomena that were interpreted as portents and commingled them with adding some that were not historical for effect. So what if there was darkness that day of Jesus' crucifixion and Matthew added the thing about the raised saints in order for effect? So this is the way the Greco-Roman and Jewish literature, this is how it was written back then. So, I can say the thing about 9/11 was an earth-shaking event, or it rained cats and dogs, or his eyes were bigger than his stomach. These kinds of things, to just give you an example of how some of this thing, we do some of the same things today. But when you read the Greco-Roman and Jewish literature, it's really an eye-opener to show this is how they wrote back then. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that people would have thought that a cow gave birth to a lamb when the temple was destroyed because Josephus said it, or that streams stopped flowing and black intestines were seen outside of cattle, and that pale phantoms were seen walking around at sunset, because Livy reports. I don't know that people would have interpreted that back then as it actually having occurred.
Okay. Well, if that is the case, there are a lot of people who have been reading their Bibles wrong and have a very gross misunderstanding.
Well, that's true, but
what he did.
in the early church, you had some men who were performing self-castration over Jesus' statement, that some made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom.
That
And you
was
had to
most
have,
unfortunate, wasn't it?
yeah, I mean, hermeneutical blunders can have tragic consequences. You imagine being one of the guys that did that. And they say, well, you know what? That was not really meant to be understood in a literal sense.
You know what? I actually thought about that when I was a teen Christian. This is the type of Christian that I was. Let's not dwell on that, though. Thank goodness I still sing bass. So, look, you've been generous with your time. Do you have another 15 minutes so that we can talk about miracles?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Okay. Well, one thing, just because I think some of the questions on miracles have already been covered in what we've been talking, but one thing is, so I'm just sort of interested in what we're going on, because I know in a couple weeks' time, David's going to be mounting an argument from biblical confusion, and I see that as sort of related to this question. So I'm just sort of curious if I could recruit you and get some of your feedback, Mike. But do you think that the average Christian is dependent upon scholarship to identify, the different types of literature? The fact that this is apocalyptic genre within the genre, or something like that, or are there indications within the Bible itself that the average Christian can pick up on, or are they dependent on scholarship to differentiate between the different types of texts? And if so, do you see that as a problem at all?
Well, it's certainly a challenge, right? I don't see any harm, though, if the person in the pew who's not acquainted with Christian scholarship and interprets those saints raised at Jesus' death, reported in Matthew, if they interpret that historically and Matthew didn't mean it that way, I mean, there's really no harm done in that. There is harm done if they read Jesus' statement in the Sermon on the Mount, if your right eye makes you sin, rip it out and throw it from you. Now, because it goes on to say, for it is better for you to lose a part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you sin, cut it off and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose a body part than for your whole body to go into hell. Well, there's nothing in that text that would seem to suggest that that is not to be understood in a literal sense. But why is it that most Christians, the majority of them, don't cut their hands off or gouge their eye out if they're lusting?
Because most of them aren't that crazy. I don't think it's because they have a more nuanced understanding of the literature, though.
Yeah, I would say that they want to. They're guessing it's probably not meant to be understood in a literal sense, and they would be right, even though there's nothing in the text that would suggest that that would be the case. But then when you read Seneca, who is believed to be the brightest Roman mind of the first century, who died around the same time as the Apostle Paul, he said, if your heart is evil, rip it out. So he says the same kind of thing. And of course, he's not saying that to kill himself. Paul rephrases that in his letters. He just says it in a different way. Consider the members of your earthly body to be dead to immorality, evil desire, passion, and greed. So it's like, if you take Paul's word there, look, if you have a problem with lusting, act as though you don't have any eyes. Go and act as though you don't have any eyes, and because blind people can't lust in that sense. They can't look on a woman and lust after her. A dead person can't murder someone else. So if you're really upset with someone, you want to kill them, consider the members of your earthly body to be dead in that sense. Well, dead people can't do it. I think Jesus is just using hyperbolic shock language there, the same kind of stuff that Seneca used. If your eye causes you to lust, rip it out, like as though you don't have one. So there's nothing in the text that would suggest that. But when you read outside the text in the Greco-Roman literature, then it's like, you can gain some insight.
Right. So I get what you're saying there, but once again, Jesus' language can be a little bit more confusing than that of Seneca, I think, because Jesus does go on to say it's better to enter heaven maimed than to have your whole body burned up in hell. And so we then start impinging on another major doctrine, a doctrine of hell, that people would use this passage to say, look, so there is a hell, and it is punishment, and it's, you can be burned up, and you get a lot of things from this passage. And once again, I'm not arguing what the proper hermeneutical method is for sorting that out, but it's a little bit more complicated because it is connected to other things that Christians, at least of a certain persuasion, take very literally.
Yeah, and the concept of hell and the nature of it is something for a different discussion, but I don't see where that really complicates this more. It's close enough to what Seneca's saying to suggest that this is not to be understood in a literal sense. And certainly Jesus' disciples didn't interpret it that way, because we don't hear about them tearing out their eye or cutting their hand off. And certainly as men, they would have struggled with sin and lust just like any other man does.
Sure. So that said, let's jump into a little bit of miracles. I can't help but follow up with a thing that I feel like I'd regret if I didn't ask you, though. The Sermon on the Mount, or the Plain,
Yeah.
whichever you prefer. Literal, not literal. Did it actually happen, or are people saying, well, this is the sort of thing that Jesus would have said?
Yeah.
So
Well, there's certainly we have two versions. Go ahead. I'm sorry to
no.
interrupt.
It's just kind of to round off that question and that understanding and take it outside of the more phenomenal thing like the resurrections. Just something as simple as the Sermon on the Mount, and we get some narrative and some setup, and this is how it happened, and this is where the apostles were standing. Are we to read that as if it actually happened, or is this just a kind of a setup? A narrative set up so that they can say, this is the sort of thing that you might have heard Jesus say?
Well, I think the latter one would have been allowable, but I think the former one is what happened. What we do have two different versions of the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain. I'm pretty certain that they're the same event because of where it appears chronologically, what comes after it, and so forth. I was in Jerusalem or Israel in October of 2017, going back October this year, and I stood at a place very close to the traditional site of the Sermon on the Mount, and I recited it. It's on my YouTube channel. You can see it, and the acoustics were just terrible. There's just no way that if Jesus was on top of the Sermon on the Mount, as Matthew portrays, that more than 5,000 people would have heard him. But if you go to the traditional site, where Jesus is at the bottom of the mount on the plain, and the people would have been sitting on the hill, the acoustics are phenomenal. And so Luke's setting is probably correct, is almost certainly correct, whereas Matthew's is not. What most scholars do think is that Matthew, who is showing Jesus as a type of a lawgiver here, a type of Moses, that there's this Egypt and Israel thing that is going on. He relocates where Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount, the law. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you, to represent God and the law up there. And then he comes down, just like Moses came down off the mount. He's doing this to give you a picture. There's a portrait. There's an underlying message in here. And most scholars, New Testament scholars, think that Matthew has taken a number of the teachings that Jesus gave on the Sermon on the Mount, like those reported in Luke, and then he has called teachings that Jesus gave elsewhere, and he's weaved them together in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. So if we'd been there with a video camera, we would have seen Jesus on the plain. We would have heard him give teachings much like we read in Luke, and parts of them in Matthew. But if we'd been there, you would say, well, wait a minute, there are a number of these teachings I didn't hear Jesus give right here, but they're in Matthew. And if you were talking to Matthew or one of Jesus' disciples, they would have said, oh yeah, but Jesus taught these things elsewhere. And Matthew just takes them together and weaves them into this. This is what most scholars believe. So yeah, does that help your question?
Sure. It adds to the list of scholarly opinion about what happened, and so I wanted to get yours there. I respect that opinion. I think that's probably pretty close to the middle of the road. But there are scholarly opinions to the left and the right of you on that. So I would just point that out.
Well, there's certainly there on the right. And I'm sure there's some on the left, but I think that's what I'm just giving you is the opinion of a pretty large majority of New Testament scholars, including evangelicals. Now, of course, there are going to be some scholars, they're usually not gospel specialists, but there are going to be some scholars that would disagree with that. But I think they just have an anachronistic view of what we're supposed to be reading in ancient biography. And what I just mentioned Matthew doing, that's just part and parcel of ancient biography. Matthew would not be unique there. Other ancient biographers would do the same sort of stuff.
Sure.
All right.
So Dale, take us to miracles, Dale, and close us out.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah. Now, sort of focusing on to miracle accounts in particular. In the first place, we've already mentioned your research into the resurrection miracle specifically, but apart from the resurrection, do you think there are any specific miracle accounts that we have good evidence to suppose are historical in nature, and versus any particular miracle accounts that we're not sure happened, or we can or scholars can conclude probably didn't happen?
And if I can ask a follow-up right now, should we take every miracle account in the Bible literally, as we understand literal today, or should we read them as maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen? How are we supposed to read the average miracle that we run across in Matthew or Luke?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer. David, I would say that my personal belief is that the miracles that are reported in the Gospels, I think that they actually occurred. I think all of them occurred. Okay, but I cannot prove that as a historian. If I'm trying to prove something as a historian, then I would look at it and I would say, all right, what evidence do we have for this stuff? And of course, it's possible that just like you have Matthew doing with the Sermon on the Mount, that you have some miracle accounts in the Gospels where there's some conflation of two miracles that are going on, and they're conflated and represented as one for purposes of economy of the text. Is it possible that when Matthew says that there were two demon-possessed guys there for Legion, whereas the others say that there was one, were there two guys, and that the other Gospels just report one because that was the person speaking? That's called literary spotlighting. It's one of the most common literary techniques in ancient biography. It's amazing how prevalent it is throughout Plutarch's lives. Is that going on, or was he aware of another demon possession where Jesus exorcised the demon? That's the stories in Mark or in Luke, and rather than narrate that, he just has two demon-possessed guys that Jesus expels the demons from. We can say we might prefer one or the other, but we just really don't know. So some of that could be going on. As a historian, I might look and say, well, I'm going to apply the same kind of criteria that I would apply to other things. Does this appear in some of the earlier sources? Is it multiply attested? Now, of course, if Matthew and Luke are using Mark as their primary source, as most scholars believe, then just because it's in Matthew or Luke and Mark doesn't mean that it's multiply attested. But if it's in Mark and it's in John, well, then that's a different thing. Maybe you could say that there's a case for multiple attestation there, especially if we take it, as I and a number of scholars do, that Mark is reporting the recollections of Peter as he recalled Peter teaching them. I think there's really good evidence for that. And in fact, the majority of scholars do hold that Mark is, a slight majority of scholars hold that Mark is reporting what he heard Peter say. The majority of scholars today do think that John's gospel was not written by the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, but whoever wrote it was either one of Jesus's minor disciples, an eyewitness, or that the author, who would be unknown to us, was using one of Jesus' disciples, whether a minor disciple or John, the son of Zebedee, as their primary source. Either way, it's based on eyewitness testimony. So you'd have two gospels there, independent of one another, based on rooted in eyewitness testimony, reporting the same kind of miracle. And I think that could show that that would give evidence weighing in favor of the authenticity or historicity of that miracle. And there are a number of miracles in the Gospels that we can establish like that. Most of them, no. I will say that the majority of scholars today, a virtual unanimous or consensus of scholars would say that Jesus was known as a miracle worker and exorcist during his lifetime. That's not to say that they believe that what he did was actual miracles and exorcisms, but that he performed certain deeds that astonished crowds, and both he and his followers and others who saw it believed them to be divine miracles and exorcisms. They believe that the scholars believe the evidence is good enough to establish that without necessarily weighing on the authenticity of a particular miracle count in the Gospels.
Okay, perfect. So I think when I heard there, but you personally also think that some specific accounts, like I'm thinking of sort of like Graham 12th Tree. I think he has a list of like 22 or something.
Yep, he's the guy on that. He's the best guy on weighing on the historicity of Jesus's miracles in his book, Jesus the Miracle Worker.
Perfect. All right. And are there any particular accounts on the flip side for the skeptics, though? Are there any particular miracle accounts that you think there are good evidences that might suggest that it didn't happen historically? I know you don't believe that.
Let me give you a better out than that. Kind of like with the Matthew 27 issue, you would say, no, that's not a miracle story at all.
Right.
It's something else, a different type of speech. So do you think that there are maybe some miracle stories that are understood as miracle stories, but that aren't miracle stories, and so therefore they wouldn't have literally happened?
You know, that Jesus performed, there are none that come to my mind.
What about Virgin
right on.
Birth, star, the magic star, that kind of stuff?
Right after I wrote my book, my large book on the resurrection, IVP asked me to do one of similar size on the virgin birth, and I had just moved on to the Gospels at that point, and I declined. I just haven't studied it enough, David, to be honest with you, to be able to weigh in on that. Do I think the virgin birth happened? Yeah. I mean, after all, if a guy rose from the dead, a virgin birth is child's play, pun intended. But if I found out that it wasn't intended, that Matthew and Luke did not intend to communicate that was a literal historical event, it wouldn't bother my faith at all.
So if a person, let's take the resurrection off the table, if there were some miracles that they didn't believe, they looked at it and said, yeah, I don't actually believe that happened, that wouldn't be a matter of faith to you. I know that it would be for some Christians, but would you say that there are miracles that Christians have to believe, or is it a matter of, well, you can believe it or not believe it? Where do you
well,
stand
in
there?
terms of specific miracles, again, the majority of scholars would look and they'd say Jesus' miracles are multiply attested in multiple independent sources. They're attested in non-Christian sources, unsympathetic sources, early sources, embarrassing type sources, stories. So we have every reason historically to think that Jesus was performing deeds that were interpreted by him, his disciples, and others as divine miracles and exorcisms. That doesn't establish the historicity of any particular one in the Gospels, but almost all scholars today, New Testament scholars, even the atheist ones like Ehrman. Well, no, not Ehrman. He's like alone, actually. He admits to being in a very small minority, and the minority, he's probably in a minority of just one when it comes to scholars that would say that Jesus was not known as a miracle worker during his lifetime. So the evidence is there to establish that he was a miracle worker, however you might interpret the nature of those deeds. The one miracle of Jesus that I think a Christian cannot deny and still be a Christian is his resurrection. That was certainly meant to be interpreted or understood in a historical sense, and to deny the resurrection of Jesus. Paul says, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, divine, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. So the resurrection is the foundation of the truth of the Christian faith. To deny it, I find it difficult to believe that one can even be a true Christian at that point.
Mike Licona, it has been a true pleasure to have you on the show. There's so much more that I know that both Dale and I would like to ask you, but we're going to let you go, and maybe you will agree to come back again in a few months. It would be great to follow up on some of these threads that we've pulled. But I, for one, would like to say it's been a delight. I expected it to be a delight, and it met and exceeded my expectations. So thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with us.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Dale. It was a pleasant time. I'd be happy to come back on sometime.
Excellent. And Mike, before you go, before you do hang up or whatever, just give us some sources or maybe specific articles or blogs on your website or debates, and we can provide that up for people to check out as well.
Yeah, well, I do have articles. I do have we have a new Risen Jesus podcast. You can find that on YouTube. You can find it on iTunes and Google Play. It's the Risen Jesus podcast. We just came out with that November 1st. We have 8 episodes. We'll be doing. That was our first season. We'll be doing another season or 2 this year. They can subscribe on my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube, type in my name. You'll see my YouTube channel. Subscribe to it, and we've got plenty of videos on there of debates and lectures, things like, did Christians borrow from pagan myths? Did, are the Gospels historically reliable? Things like that. My debates with Ehrman, my debate with John Dominic Crossan and others are on my YouTube channel. They can all see those there.
Perfect.
Very good. For the listener next week, Gary Habermas, I expect an equally good conversation. And thank you all for listening. Thanks, Mike, once again. Thank you, Dale. And we'll see you next time.
All right. Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.